ABC General Hospital spoilers reveal that Port Charles had seen violence before, but this was different. This was not the kind of bloodshed that exploded and then faded by morning. This was the kind that stayed in the air, the kind that clung to people, stained their choices, altered the shape of every relationship it touched. One shot on the pier had changed everything. One terrified, irreversible pull of the trigger had torn through the lives of Jason, Britt, Rocco, Dante, and everyone unlucky enough to stand close to the fallout. What should have been a desperate act of rescue instantly became the beginning of a war over truth, loyalty, and survival. And the cruelest part was that no one involved had the luxury of innocence anymore. Rocco was not supposed to become a boy with blood on his conscience. He was not supposed to carry the memory of a body collapsing because of something he had done. In that terrible moment on the pier, fear had moved faster than thought. He had seen Jason cornered, Britt unconscious, danger closing in with no one else there to stop it, and instinct had done what childhood never should have been forced to do. But once the gunshot faded, the horror began. The image would not leave him, neither would the knowledge that no explanation, no matter how true, would erase what happened inside him when panic became action. He had not acted out of malice, but the world would never care about that distinction as much as his family did. And that was where the real nightmare began. Jason understood that before anyone else did. He took one look at Rocco and saw a future collapsing in real time. He saw a boy on the edge of being swallowed by guilt, by police questions, by courtrooms, by headlines, by the permanent psychological damage of being told for the rest of his life that he had crossed a line no child should ever approach. Jason had lived too long in the shadows not to recognize the machinery already beginning to turn. Once the truth came out, it would not matter that Cullum had been a threat. It would not matter that Britt was in danger. It would not matter that Rocco had acted in terror. The system would take what happened and reduce it to cold language, hard consequences, and public judgment. Jason could not allow that. For him, the decision came with brutal clarity. He would become the killer in the story. He would carry the weight. He would tell the lie if it meant Rocco got to keep the rest of his life. That choice was not noble in any simple way. It was darker than that, more painful, more complicated. Jason was not stepping forward because he believed sacrifice cleansed anything. He was doing it because he knew exactly what ruin looked like and had decided, with the fatal calm that defined him, that it would be better on him than on a child. But beneath that resolve was another truth he could barely admit even to himself. Taking the blame also gave Jason a reason to disappear. It gave him a final role to play in a life that had never really allowed him peace. If he confessed to killing Cullum, then everything changed at once. He would no longer be a man trying to help Britt escape. He would become a hunted man with no future in Port Charles. And maybe in some bitter, twisted way that felt familiar enough to survive, Britt woke up to a world even more dangerous than the one she had nearly died in. Escaping Cullum should have felt like liberation, but freedom came wrapped in panic. Her body hurt, her mind raced, and the first truth she had to confront was that the pier had not set her free. It had simply shifted her from one prison to another. Cullum might be gone, but the system that controlled him was not. Sidwell was still out there. Brennan was still moving pieces. The forces that had used her intelligence, her fear, and her vulnerability as leverage had not vanished with a single bullet. And now the situation was worse, because Rocco was involved. Jason was preparing to bury himself for that involvement. The escape she had imagined, the fragile dream of leaving with some version of hope intact, was now poisoned by debt, guilt, and the unbearable knowledge that the people trying to save her were destroying themselves in the process. For Britt, that realization ignited a different kind of fury. Not the hot, explosive kind, but the colder rage of someone who had spent too long being cornered, handled, manipulated, and traded between powerful men as if her fate were a strategic problem instead of a human life. She had clawed her way back from death, humiliation, and abandonment before, but this time the cost felt even crueler. She was being offered survival at the price of Jason's future and Rocco's innocence. That was not rescue. That was a rearranged form of captivity. The temptation to run was still there, still urgent, still logical. Take Rocco, vanish, build a life far from Port Charles, far from WSB games and Cassadine ghosts and men like Sidwell. But Britt was too smart not to see the flaw. There was no clean escape left. Every road out had blood on it now. Dante was ripped apart in the most merciless way possible, not by an enemy, but by the collision of his two identities. As a cop, he could not ignore a dead man, a fleeing suspect, and a trail of lies forming around the case before the body had even gone cold. As a father, he could already sense the unbearable shape of the truth pressing in. There was something wrong in the way events were unfolding, something too convenient in the idea that Jason had suddenly become the sole architect of the chaos. Dante knew Jason was capable of violence. He also knew Jason's instincts where children were concerned. The more pieces fell into place, the more he hated what the answer might be. Because if Rocco had pulled that trigger, then Dante's life was about to split open. His badge would demand one thing. His heart would demand another. And whichever side he chose, some essential part of him would be destroyed. His anger turned raw and directionless. He was furious at Jason for putting himself in the center of the lie, furious at Britt for being the spark for so much danger, furious at the unseen forces that had turned his son into collateral damage, and most of all, furious at himself for failing to protect Rocco from ever getting this close to darkness. Dante had spent years trying to believe that his family could survive Port Charles by staying one step ahead of its chaos. Now that illusion was gone, chaos was not circling the family anymore. It had entered the house, sat at the table, and placed a gun in his son's trembling hands. Laura felt the wider pattern before others did. She had seen too many crises to believe this was random. Marco's stabbing, Martin's sudden exit, Sidwell's threats, Britt's attempted escape, Jason's abrupt turn into fugitive martyrdom. None of it felt isolated. It felt engineered. It felt like pressure being applied from multiple sides until people began making desperate, terrible choices that served someone else's design. That was what made the entire situation so much more frightening. Cullum's death did not end the conspiracy. It deepened it. Men like Cullum were disposable. The people above him were not. Laura understood that the city was no longer dealing with one violent predator. It was dealing with a system that fed on panic and silence, and now a child had become one of its newest victims. Alexis saw another version of the same truth through Danny. If Rocco was the boy who pulled the trigger, then Danny was the boy forced to watch adults collapse around him under the weight of secrets. He had already seen Jason run, seen Dante fall, seen fear replace trust in a matter of seconds. Alexis recognized the damage in that kind of confusion. Children did not need full explanations to be scarred. They only needed to realize that the adults they loved were hiding the truth and calling it protection. That was how families fractured, not in one dramatic scream, but in layers of concealment, one necessary lie at a time. Alexis feared that everyone was now moving toward exactly that cliff, convincing themselves that one more cover-up would save the people they loved, when in reality it might poison them beyond repair. And still, Jason kept moving toward confession with the terrible steadiness of a man who had already accepted exile. He began calculating every consequence with brutal precision. What evidence could be shaped? What timeline could hold? What he would need Britt to deny? How long he could keep the lie stable before it cracked under scrutiny? But beneath the calculation was grief, and beneath the grief was rage. Rage at Cullum for forcing the moment. Rage at Sidwell for reaching into lives he had no right to touch. Rage at Port Charles itself for always demanding that someone bleed to keep the illusion of order intact. Jason was tired of being the man built for sacrifice, but he did not know how to stop being him. So he chose the familiar wound. He chose disappearance. He chose to become the monster in the official version of events so Rocco could remain a frightened kid instead of a public tragedy. What made the entire situation even more volatile was Britt's growing refusal to simply let Jason throw himself away. The more she understood his plan, the more she resisted the idea that he alone got to decide the shape of everyone else's fate. That resistance carried danger of its own. Because if Britt pushed back hard enough, if she threatened to expose the truth or undermine the confession, then the fragile shield around Rocco would shatter. Yet if she stayed silent, she would be participating in the same cycle of manipulation that had nearly destroyed her. This was where the story sharpened into something even darker. No one was just protecting anyone anymore. They were all controlling one another through fear, guilt, and love, twisted into obligation. That was the real horror rising over Port Charles. Not simply that Cullum was dead, or that Rocco had fired the fatal shot, or that Jason was ready to lie. It was that every person touched by the event was already changing into someone harsher, more secretive, more desperate than before. Rocco was losing innocence. Dante was losing certainty. Britt was losing faith in escape. Jason was losing whatever future he had allowed himself to imagine. And in the distance, the true power players were still watching, still waiting, still ready to exploit the next fracture. So the pier did not end the story. It detonated it. What followed was not rescue, but fallout. Not healing, but rearrangement. A city built on secrets was preparing to swallow another one, and this secret was especially cruel because it had been born from love, panic, and the instinct to save a life. That was what made it so devastating. The people at the center of it were not cold-blooded villains. They were damaged, cornered souls making impossible choices under impossible pressure. But in Port Charles, even the purest motive could become the first step toward destruction. And if Jason truly took the fall for Cullum's death, then the next chapter would not be about justice at all. It would be about whether the people left behind could survive the lie that saved them. Port Charles is on the verge of a far more personal nightmare. Because Cullum's death may not have ended the danger at all, it may have only changed its face. If Carson Boatman enters this story as Cullum's younger brother, then the fallout from the pier shooting instantly becomes more vicious, more intimate, and far more terrifying for Britt and Rocco. This would no longer be just about a cover-up, a police investigation, or Jason's decision to take the blame. It would become a revenge story, driven by grief, humiliation, and obsession, and that is exactly what makes it so explosive. Cullum's brother would not need to arrive in Port Charles shouting threats or waving a gun. That would be too easy, too predictable. The real danger would come if he arrived calm, polished, and deceptively controlled, hiding his rage behind a quiet determination to learn what really happened the night his brother died. He would sense almost immediately that the official version of events does not add up. Jason's willingness to shoulder the blame would feel too convenient. Britt's desperation to leave town would feel too urgent. Rocco's silence would feel too haunted. And once he begins to suspect that a frightened child was the one who pulled the trigger, everything changes. That is when revenge stops being a mission and becomes an obsession. In his mind, his brother would no longer be just a dead criminal. He would become a man who was cheated, erased, and denied justice by a powerful group of people protecting their own. Britt would become the symbol of everything that went wrong. She survived. She escaped. She became the reason his brother lost control, and now she is the center of a lie that everyone is helping to maintain. Rocco, meanwhile, would become the secret at the center of that lie, the fragile weak point that could blow up every life connected to the shooting. For Britt, the terror would take on a new shape. She may have escaped Cullum physically, but she would quickly realize she has not escaped what he set in motion. Just when she starts imagining a new life, just when she dares to believe that she and Rocco could get away from Sidwell's shadow and all the violence tied to it, Cullum's brother would begin closing in. Not with open attacks at first, but with pressure. Strange sightings, silent intimidation, the unbearable feeling of being watched, the horror of realizing that freedom was only an illusion. That would push Britt into a darker emotional state, where every choice feels poisoned. If she runs, she risks making Rocco look even guiltier. If she stays, she risks letting the danger get close enough to destroy them both. Rocco would suffer the most because he is already breaking inside. He did not shoot Cullum out of cruelty. He acted out of panic, out of fear, out of a desperate instinct to stop a man who was about to kill Jason and leave Britt for dead. But that truth would not protect him from guilt. It would not stop the nightmares. It would not stop the tremor in his hands every time he remembers the sound of the shot. If Cullum's brother begins targeting him psychologically, Rocco could spiral fast. The fear of being exposed would mix with the fear of being hunted, and that pressure could turn him into a child forced to carry an adult-sized burden he was never meant to survive. Jason's decision to take the blame would only make the story more heartbreaking. What once looked like a noble sacrifice would start to feel like the first crack in a much bigger disaster. He could lie to the police. He could run. He could bury the truth to protect Rocco from prison, scandal, and public ruin. But none of that would stop a grieving brother who wants more than justice. This man would want emotional destruction. He would want Britt to feel unsafe. He would want Rocco to drown in fear. He would want Jason to understand that one desperate act on the pier did not save anyone cleanly. It created a wound that is still bleeding. That is what makes this twist so powerful. It pushes Britt and Rocco into a new kind of obsession, one built on fear, secrecy, and the constant sense that the past is hunting them. Britt would become more desperate, more protective, and more unstable as she realizes that survival is no longer enough. Rocco would become trapped between guilt and terror, unable to breathe under the weight of what he did and what may still be coming for him. And if Cullum's brother is smart, patient, and ruthless, then Port Charles is not heading into a simple revenge arc. It is heading into a psychological war where the real goal is not just punishment, but total emotional collapse.